Um, I got to say that I'm already pretty well talked out, so I'm not going to be using my 20 minutes. At least I'll try not to. Just want to make just a few points to this discussion. I'll make some references to the history of that period and the role the Communist Party played. But like Mike, I'd like to bring it forward in the sense of looking at, how this connects to the, how it is relevant today in the struggle today and the big challenges that are before the whole working class and Canadian people as a whole today. I said earlier that you have to be very careful about drawing parallels or, mechanical conclusions or, trying to apply mechanistically experiences from the 30s today, because the situation, of course, is very different. You take the struggle, for instance, of the unemployed and the Communist Party, and I know you didn't mean to understate it, but, it wasn't just a question of having done a lot of good work in the unemployed movement. It built the movement of the unemployed, the Ottawa Trek, and so on and so forth. This was an initiative of the party, and it was decisive in terms of bringing thousands and thousands of unemployed workers into the streets, onto the rails, and onto Ottawa. And I would suggest to you that mobilization, together with other efforts, and you had, like, for instance, some very important strikes and sit-ins and so on, like right here in Vancouver at the Vancouver Post Office and so on, all of those mobilizations, most of which were led by communists and militant workers, so some militant social democrats as well, but certainly with a central role played by communists, paved the way for the defeat of the Iron Heel Bennett government in the elections in 1935. And I think, again, this experience has some relevance today and into the future. How to defeat Harper? Will we defeat Harper simply by playing the loyal opposition and looking for scandals and hoping that ultimately the Canadian people will be fed up with that and opt for any other option? Heaven forbid they should go with Ignatieff, sometimes I wonder which one is further to the right, really. But anyway, but it's precisely through bringing people into motion, uniting them, agitating them, and fighting that helps to change people's consciousness. And even sections of working people who are passive, who don't come out to those rallies. The very size and the dynamic of those kinds of mobilizations comes to the attention of broad sections of the people. They say, yeah, well, I should have gone. I should have been part of it. But, they're right. We need to change. The struggle against the Harris Tories in Ontario, an important part of that struggle were the mobilizations, the Harris days, with all of the problems, with all of the attempts by the top leadership of the labor movement to kind of curtail it and control it and confine it and eventually to shut it down, nonetheless played a very important role in eventually winning the people of Ontario to throw the Harris Tories out. And so what was the big question, especially after the crash in 1929 and the onset in real terms with factories closing and people being thrown out of work and farmers becoming destitute in the prairies and so on? What was the real burning question of the day? The question was, is this the time to fight or is this the time to duck and run for cover? Because on the face of it, it looked very much like this is not the time to fight and win. You can't win because there's over 20%, 25% of the workers are unemployed. And you go on strike and you set up a picket line in the front of the plant and the employer opens up the back door and there's hundreds of thousands, and they're not bad people. You can dismiss it, call them scabs and so on and so forth, but the people were desperate. There was no unemployment insurance. There was, they were lining up in soup kitchens and outside churches to get a bowl of soup. And so on the face of it, it looked like, how could you win a strike in such circumstances? And so it wasn't just because of, crass treachery of the top leadership of the Trades and Labor Congress and, blah, blah, blah. It was this assessment that if you look at things in a metaphysical way as opposed to a dialectical way, it looks very much like that was not the time to fight. That was just ride out that storm. You have to give concessions, take backs, take it in the chin, and wait for the wheels of industry to start turning again, right? For the recovery to come, and then the jobs will come back. And then maybe we can make some gains, or at least catch up for what we've conceded, in the depth of the Depression. And we know that the ruling class always uses their crises to reorganize industry, to increase productivity, and to squeeze the working class and make working people pay for the cost of the crisis. They always do that. Nothing new. Unfortunately, people have to keep learning and relearning these lessons, but this is truth, and it predates even the Great Depression. You can go back to the recessions and depressions in the 1870s and so on. You can see this pattern. And the reality is that it was the communists at that time who said, no, it is possible to organize. It is possible to fight, to hit the bricks, to take on the bosses, and to take on their governments, and win, even in these horrendous conditions, which look very negative, because the balance of forces look pretty bad, right? And it's a fact that during that period from 31 to 34, 35, when eventually the Workers' Unity League was folded up, and it was, we can get in all sorts of discussions about that, and I think even in our party, by the way, this is, it was probably a serious misjudgment to have done that, to go into the CIO and eventually into the Canadian Congress of Labour and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that the height of the Depression in Canada, in that period from 31 to 35, there was like approximately 170 big strikes. Over 100 of them were led by the Workers' Unity League. And the percentage of those strikes that actually won was even higher. That is to say that, the strikes led by the wool, the Workers' Unity League had the best chances of winning because they were very militant. And you can go back to Cape Breton, even in the 20s, and the role of people like J.B. McLaughlin, coal miners, and so on and so forth. And it was precisely because they were so militant and prepared to fight and prepared to give leadership that they were the primary targets of the Canadian state, ideologically, in the courts, and so on and so forth, using Section 98. You go back and look at newspapers like the Chronicle Herald in Halifax in the 20s and how they vilified people like J.B. McLaughlin and others in Cape Breton. They actually put horns on them, and, because they were fearful. They understood very well.
What did you call this newspaper, the National Post?
No, the Chronicle Herald was a bourgeois paper, but you see that in one, and certainly that was the case during the 30s as well. But that's not to say in a narrow sectarian way that, well, we were right, we told you so. That's not the issue. It's not important. And if it was some other political movement that had played that role, I would say exactly the same thing. That we've made a mistake. We should have learned from that group. What's most important is how we see that connecting to the situation that exists today. And so what do we have? We have a circumstance where, on the one hand, we need unity within the working class movement and the organized section of the trade union movement now more than ever before. Because the ruling class is picking off one section of workers after the other. They went after the auto workers. They went after the civic workers in Toronto. Right? Now they're going after other sections of public sector workers and so on and so forth. Woodworkers, the health, And how to respond in the face of this onslaught. To leave each section of workers to do the best they can to fight the good fight? That's no solution. That's one of the reasons why why we've called upon the leadership of the CLC to convene a people's assembly, not just of labor, and certainly not just of their affiliates. Because in Quebec, for instance, there's 4 labor centrals, only one of which is affiliated to the CLC. That's the FTQ, but there's the CSN, the CSQ, and so on. To bring all organized workers together and all of their allies, Aboriginal peoples, the student movement, the Aboriginal, the women's movement, the environmental movement, bring all of these forces together and say, let's work out a common plan that advances the interests of the people on all of these fronts. And let's mobilize in terms of extra parliamentary activity. And if the Liberals come along, great. The NDP comes along, or the Bloc Québécois, even better. But that's the kind of initiative that needs to be taken. Everywhere you look, workers are prepared to fight. Sometimes they have to fight their own frigging union leadership. But that's what needs to be turned around. Well, that's the one side of it, the need for unity. But the other side of it, there has to be a battle of ideas. And that's where unity and struggle always comes into this. If you put all of the emphasis on struggle, if you put all of the emphasis on just denouncing those misleaders, those bastards at the top, and don't fight for unity, then you descend into sectarianism. But if you only talk about unity without also combating ideas and perspectives which undermine the fight back, then that's a hollow unity. I'll give you a good example. Back in January, the most honorable, Jack Layton was invited by the Toronto Board of Trade to speak to that august body. Well, the Board of Trade in any city or town or village in this country is what? It's a bourgeois club, right? Of business. But the Toronto Board of Trade, this is the creme de la creme of monopoly capital, both domestic and international in Canada, right? So when you come and speak before the Toronto Board of Trade, that's something quite different. And what did Brother Layton have to say in January? He talked about, the heroism of the Canadian people to build up our country and to blaze a trail across, build the railways, and, build the farms and the wheat fields, and blah, blah, blah. Well, it was fine, nice fluff, it was good, it's all right. No problem there, it's true. But then, he said, we need the same kind of heroics today. We need the heroism where a worker accepts a wage cut so that his fellow workers can keep their jobs. And he got a standing ovation. What a great service he provided. And what was he saying? He was saying, in effect, that from his perspective, from the perspective of his party that he leads, that for their part, they will do everything possible to convince workers to accept those concessions and to retreat. Now, our party came out and criticized that. I looked elsewhere on the left. I didn't see too much criticism on Babel and elsewhere. I didn't see it.
We called for his resignation over that.
Well, there you go. Well, somebody. Well, good for you. That's all right.
You guys should get together.
So, no. Well, we should all get together. That's the point. That's the point. But part of it is to struggle against these tendencies and perspectives that obstruct and hold back and, in fact, undermine the fight back of the people. And that's a difficult act. It's hard to unite and struggle at the same time. It ain't easy. And there's no roadmap that'll prevent you from making errors, leftist errors, rightist errors. It's not easy. But life ultimately asserts itself. Why? Because there's no other way forward. And there is that pressure from below. You look what happened. There was some discussion earlier, maybe this morning. I missed some of the sessions this morning, and I'm sorry for that. Well, what's been going on in Ottawa in the Ford, given the Ford negotiations? Not in Canada, but in the U.S., where what was the final figure? 73% rejection, something in that order. In plant after plant after plant across the U.S., a rejection of a concessionary agreement put forward by their own leadership. And in a number of those plants, when the top leadership of the UAW went there, in some cases they weren't even allowed, the workers kept them out of their own meetings. And in other instances, as soon as they got on the podium, they were booed down by the membership. There is a rising militancy. And that's what must continue to give us some confidence and hope in the future. But we shouldn't just expect it to develop spontaneously, because workers are afraid too. They have to feed their families, and they're worried about, their retirement, and they're worried about losing their homes and so on and so forth.
Yeah, we are.
Really, of course, naturally. And so the struggle for leadership is important. So how to do that and at the same time unite? Well, that's a challenge. And we don't say in the Communist Party we have all the answers to that. But we think that of all of, the left and progressive forces and the labor movement and beyond and the people's movements, and all the potential that they can marshal if we're brought together, that we can do that. Thank you.